The Chamber of Infinite Voices had stood for 11,000 years. It had been carved from the heart of a dead star by the Velnathi architects in an age when the galaxy was young and untamed, when the first species had clawed their way out of their respective cradles and looked upon the cosmos with trembling wonder. The chamber was a masterpiece of engineering and artistry, a spherical amphitheater large enough to hold the delegated representatives of over 700 sentient species, its walls lined with translation matrices so advanced that they could render the concept of grief in the clicking language of the KTH tele, or describe the beauty of a supernova in the color-based communication of the Lumivary. The ceiling was transparent, a viewport into the nebula beyond, a swirling canvas of violet and gold that had inspired poets and philosophers from 1,000 worlds. Nothing like this had ever been built by humans. Nothing like this could have been built by humans. They were, by galactic standards, infants, 237 years since first contact, barely 3 generations since they had stumbled out of their solar system with crude fusion drives and a collective attitude that could most charitably be described as aggressively curious. They had arrived at the galactic table late, loud, and with all the grace of a startled predator. And now, on the 1462nd day of the Kren crisis, Ambassador Soren Hale walked into the Chamber of Infinite Voices and did something that had never been done in 11,000 years of recorded history. He turned off the translation matrix. Every species in the chamber felt it. The Velnathi, with their sensory crest that could detect electromagnetic fluctuations across the spectrum, winced as the subtle hum of the matrix vanished. The KTH tele, whose compound eyes were sensitive to the visible light emissions of the translation nodes embedded in every seat, watched the soft blue glow die one node at a time, rippling outward from where the human delegation sat like a wave of silence. The Lumivary shifted their pigmentation from the calm blue of attentive listening to the sharp yellow of alarm, their chromatophores flickering in patterns that, in any other context, would have been considered profane. The chamber, which had been filled with the layered polyglot symphony of 700 species speaking simultaneously through the matrix, collapsed into a chaos of raw, untranslated sound. Without the matrix, there was no common language. There was only noise, harsh clicks, and melodic trills and subsonic rumbles, and the deafening silence of species that communicated through means that required technological mediation. Talaris Vex, the presiding arbiter of the Galactic Council and a Velnathi who had held the position for 600 years, rose from the central dais. Her sensory crest flared wide, a gesture that among her people indicated absolute bewilderment. She was old. She had presided over border disputes between empires that had lasted longer than most human civilizations. She had mediated the Accord of Silent Stars, which had ended a war that had raged for 4,000 years. She had watched species rise and fall, had seen the slow, grinding machinery of galactic diplomacy reshape the map of known space a dozen times over. She had never seen anything like this. Ambassador Hale, she said, her voice rendered in the physical acoustics of the chamber without translation. Her words were melodic, a series of harmonic tones that the Velnathi produced through resonance chambers in their thoraxes. Without the matrix, only the other Velnathi in the chamber understood her. But her meaning was clear enough from her posture, from the rigid extension of her crest, from the way her 4 arms gestured sharply toward the human delegation. Soren Hale did not respond. He could not have understood her even if he had wanted to. The human auditory system was not capable of parsing Velnathi harmonic speech. He stood at the entrance to the human delegations section, a modest arc of seating that had been installed only 2 centuries prior, positioned awkwardly between the sprawling delegation platforms of the Torvellan Consortium and the Ithkari remnant. He was a tall man, by human standards, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that seemed to have been assembled from a catalog of unpleasant expressions. He wore the standard diplomatic attire of the United Earth Governance, a simple black suit with a small pin on the lapel depicting Earth's blue marble against a field of stars. He did not look angry, he did not look triumphant, he looked, if anything, bored. Behind him, the rest of the human delegation, 12 individuals, each one selected by the UEG's diplomatic corps for their expertise in interspecies relations, sat in perfect, unnerving silence. They did not look at each other. They did not fidget. They did not display any of the restless energy that humans were infamous for among the galactic community. They simply sat and watched the chamber descend into confusion. It took 17 minutes for someone to do something about it. 17 minutes. In a chamber where the average time between formal motions was measured in days, where debates could stretch into months, where the concept of urgency had been diluted by millennia of patient, glacial process into something that was theoretically acknowledged but practically non-existent. The one who finally acted was Councillor Creeth of the KTH tele. The KTH tele were an insectoid species, roughly the size of a large dog, with iridescent carapaces and compound eyes that could track movement across a spectrum far wider than human vision. Kreeth was old for a KTH telly, nearly 40 standard years, and she carried the weight of that age in the faded sheen of her carapace and the deliberate slowness of her movements. She was the longest-serving member of the council after Talaris Vex, and she had been the primary diplomatic liaison for the Kren crisis since its inception. She clicked out of her delegation platform, a sound that without the matrix was just a sharp staccato noise, and began moving across the chamber floor on her 6 legs. The other delegates parted for her, a mixture of confusion and ancient deference creating a path through the chaos. She stopped in front of the human delegation and looked up at Soren Hale. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Kreeth produced a small device from a pouch beneath her thorax, a personal translation unit, the kind that individual diplomats kept for private conversations. She activated it with a click of her mandibles, and a small speaker near her head projected words in standard Galactic Basic, the constructed lingua franca that the translation matrix normally rendered in real time. Ambassador Hale, the device said in a flat mechanical voice. Explain. Hale looked down at the KTH tele-counselor. He did not crouch, did not adjust his posture to make himself less imposing, something that every diplomat in the galaxy knew was a basic courtesy when interacting with smaller species. He simply looked down. Counselor Kreeth, he said, his voice was flat, uninflected. The translation matrix will remain offline until further notice from the United Earth Governance. Kreeth's mandibles twitched, a gesture that the personal translator did not bother to render into emotional context, but which any experienced diplomat would have recognized as the KTH tele equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. You cannot, Kreeth begins. We can, Hale said. We did. The matrix is a Velnathi construct, but it operates through a distributed network of nodes that are maintained by the Council's engineering core. 23% of those engineers are human. We informed them of this action 14 hours ago. They have complied. The matrix cannot be restored without our participation. The implications of that statement rippled through the chamber faster than the silence had. Delegates who had been murmuring to each other in their native languages, frustrated, confused, increasingly alarmed, fell silent as the understanding spread. The humans had not simply disrupted the session. They had crippled the Council's fundamental infrastructure. Every delegate who relied on the matrix to communicate, which was to say all of them, was now effectively mute. Talaris Vex descended from the dais with a grace that belied her age, her 4 arms folded in a posture that any Velnathi would recognize as barely contained fury. She had brought her own personal translator, a more sophisticated model than Kreeth's, and it rendered her words in a voice that carried the cold precision of a glacier. Ambassador Hale, you are in violation of 17 articles of the Council Charter, 3 provisions of the Accord of First Principles, and the binding agreement under which your species was granted admission to this body. The consequences for what you have done will be severe. Hale finally looked at her, his expression did not change. Arbiter Vex, with respect, your consequences are noted and declined. The chamber erupted. It was, by any measure, the single most undignified moment in the Chamber of Infinite Voices since its construction. 700 species, stripped of their ability to communicate through the matrix, resorted to every available alternative. The Torvalans, a species of massive silicon-based beings who communicated through seismic vibrations, began stamping their feet, sending tremors through the chamber floor. The Lumivary flashed in patterns of red and orange that would have been classified as obscene in any formal setting. Several of the avian delegates took flight, circling the chamber in patterns that their species used for long-distance communication, but which, in the enclosed space, created a chaos of wings and shrieks that set off a cascade of alarm responses from the predator species in attendance. Through it all, the human delegation sat in silence. It was Counselor Asara of the Ithkari remnant who brought order. The Ithkari were a species of arboreal origin, tall, slender beings with elongated limbs and large, dark eyes that had evolved to track movement through dense forest canopies. They were among the oldest spacefaring species in the galaxy, predating even the Velnatha's rise to prominence, and they carried the particular gravity of a civilization that had outlived its own greatness. Asara was 3 meters tall, and when she stood, the delegates near her instinctively quieted, not out of respect, but out of the primal response that all sentient species had to the presence of a predator, even one that had long since abandoned predation as a survival strategy. Asara did not use a personal translator. Instead, she raised one long-fingered hand and made a gesture, a closed fist, opened slowly, fingers spread wide. It was the Ithkari signal for universal attention, a gesture so old that it predated the Council itself, so deeply ingrained in galactic protocol that even species with no historical contact with the Ithkari recognized it instinctively. The chamber went quiet, Not silent, the absence of the matrix made true silence impossible in a space this large but quiet. Attentive. Asara turned to face the human delegation. She produced no translator. Instead, she began to move her hands in a slow, deliberate series of gestures. Ithkari Sign Language, another relic of their ancient civilization, developed long before they possessed the technology for complex vocal communication. It was not taught in standard diplomatic curricula. It was not commonly known outside of Ithkari cultural circles. But the humans understood it. Every one of them. Soren Hale responded in kind, his hands moving through the gestures with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a species that had only known of the Ithkari's existence for 2 centuries. His response was brief, barely 10 seconds of gesturing, but it was enough to make Asara's large eyes narrow in a way that her species had not expressed in public for thousands of years. She turned back to the chamber and made a single gesture, both hands raised, palms forward, fingers pressed together, the Ithkari signal for bear witness. Then she sat down. It took another 40 minutes for the chamber to sort itself into something resembling functional communication. Personal translators were distributed, there were never enough, and the smaller species had to share, clustering together around single devices in configurations that would have been comical under other circumstances. The Torvalans, who could not use standard translators at all due to their seismic communication method, had to rely on a hastily arranged relay system through the Velnathi delegation, who could sense their vibrations through the floor. When order had been sufficiently restored, though order was a generous description of a chamber where 700 species were crowded around inadequate translation devices like refugees around a water source, Talaris Vex addressed the assembly. The human delegation has committed an act of sabotage against the Council's core infrastructure, she said, her translated voice flat and mechanical without the Matrix's nuanced tonal rendering. This body will not be held hostage. I am invoking Emergency Protocol 7, which allows the presiding arbiter to convene a tribunal to address acts of aggression by a member species. The tribunal will. Ambassador Hale has the floor, said a voice from the back of the chamber. Every head turned. The voice had come from a human, not from the delegation's seating, but from the public gallery above. A woman stood there, young by human standards, with dark skin and close-cropped hair. She wore no diplomatic insignia, no pin, no suit, just a simple jumpsuit of the kind that human civilian spacers wore. She held no translator. She spoke in standard galactic basic, which meant that her words were only intelligible to the species who had learned the constructed language directly, without relying on the matrix for real-time translation. But that was enough. Standard Basic was the language of the Council Charter. Every diplomat in the chamber had at least a functional understanding of it, even if they could not speak it fluently. The words landed like stones in still water. Under Article 31 of the Council Charter, the woman continued, her voice carrying through the chamber with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural, any member species may petition for an emergency session of the full Council by invoking the right of universal address. This right supersedes all other procedural protocols, including Emergency Protocol 7. The invoking species is granted uninterrupted floor access for a period not to exceed 1 standard hour. Talaris Vex's crest went rigid. The right of universal address has been invoked 4 times in 11,000 years. Each time it was invoked by a species facing immediate existential threat. Humanity faces no such threat. The Kren would disagree, the woman said. The name dropped into the chamber like a detonation. Kren Crisis, 1,462 days of diplomatic sessions, emergency meetings, subcommittee hearings, fact-finding missions, shuttle diplomacy, back-channel negotiations, and every other tool in the 11,000-year arsenal of the Galactic Council. The Kren were a species that had been discovered 47 years prior, living on a cluster of moons orbiting a gas giant in a system on the far edge of the Verge, the uncharted territory beyond the Council's formal borders. They were pre-spaceflight, roughly equivalent to humanity's own technological level in the early 21st century. They were also, by every metric the Council's sociologists could devise, a deeply peaceful species. Agricultural, communal, non-hierarchical, they had no word for war in their language. They had no concept of territorial aggression. They were also being exterminated. The Zyrathi Dominion, a vast expansionist empire of reptilian superpredators that had been a member species of the Council for 6,000 years, had decided that the Kren's moons were located in a strategically valuable position. The Zyrathi had been expanding into the Verge for centuries, but they had always done so within the bounds of Council protocol, filing claims, negotiating with neighboring species, engaging in the slow dance of diplomatic expansion that the Council's charter prescribed. 4 years ago, they had simply stopped following the rules. The first reports had been fragmented. Scouts from the Verge Exploration Corps had found Kren settlements that had been destroyed from orbit, the moon's surfaces scarred by weapons fire. The Xyrathi had denied involvement. The council had formed a fact-finding committee. The committee had taken 6 months to reach the Kren system. By the time they arrived, 3 more moons had been rendered uninhabitable. The council had condemned the action. The Xyrathi had acknowledged the condemnation, expressed regret, and then proceeded to sterilize 2 more moons. A formal resolution demanding a cessation of hostilities had been introduced. It had taken 4 months to reach a vote. It passed with a majority of 612 species. The Xyrathi had abstained from the vote and then, the following day, had landed ground forces on the largest remaining Kren moon. Another resolution had been proposed, this one authorizing a peacekeeping force to be deployed to the system. The Xyrathi had filibustered the resolution for 8 months, using every procedural tool available under the Council Charter. When the resolution had finally been brought to a vote, it had failed by 11 votes, because the Xyrathi's trade partners, dependent on Dominion resources, had been pressured into voting against it. And so it had gone for 4 years. Resolution after resolution, condemnation after condemnation, committee after committee. The diplomatic machinery of the Galactic Council, which had been refined over 11,000 years to handle disputes between species that could vaporize planets, ground through the Kren crisis with the relentless, suffocating patience of a glacier. The Kren were dying, 3 billion of them when the crisis began. Current estimates based on the last reliable intelligence from Verge scout ships put the surviving population at under 400 million. The Xyrathi were not merely conquering, they were eradicating, systematically, methodically. With the efficiency of a species that had evolved to hunt and kill, and that had never, in 6,000 years of membership in the Galactic Council, fully internalized the concept that other species had a right to exist. Soren Hale moved to the central dais. Talaris Vex did not try to stop him. She was a creature of the Charter, and the Charter was clear on the right of universal address. She stepped aside, her crest folded tight against her skull in what might have been shame or might have been rage, and let the humans stand where 11,000 years of arbiters had stood. He did not speak immediately. He stood there for a long moment looking out at the chaos of the chamber, the crowded delegates, the inadequate translators, the species pressed together in configurations that violated every protocol of personal space and dignified address. He looked at the Torvalans, who could not understand a word he was saying. He looked at the Lumivari, whose color patterns indicated fear and confusion. He looked at the KTH Tele delegation, who had been the primary advocates for the Kren for 4 years and who now sat in stunned, clicking silence. He looked at the Xyrathi delegation. The Xyrathi were large, 2.5 meters tall on average, with powerful reptilian frames covered in scales that ranged from deep green to black. Their eyes were vertical slits like a terrestrial snake's, and they had evolved from apex predators on a world where the food chain had exactly one top. They did not feel fear. They did not feel guilt. They felt hunger, satisfaction, and the cold calculus of power. Their delegation occupied one of the largest platforms in the chamber, and they sat in their typical posture, upright, motionless, their slit eyes tracking movement with the unconscious precision of born hunters. There were 9 of them, 9 representatives of a dominion that spanned 400 star systems. 9 creatures who had, by proxy, orchestrated the deaths of 2.5 billion sentient beings. Hale looked at them for a long time, then he began to speak. For 1,462 days, this council has debated the Kren crisis, he said. His voice was still flat, still uninflected, but it carried through the chamber with a force that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. In that time, the Xyrathi Dominion has rendered 7 moons uninhabitable, destroyed every major Kren population center, and reduced a species of 3 billion to fewer than 400 million. The Council has passed 17 resolutions. The Xyrathi have ignored all 17. The Council has sent 3 fact-finding missions. The Xyrathi have detained 2 of them. The Council has convened 11 subcommittees. The Xyrathi have not attended a single session of any of them. He paused. The chamber was absolutely still. 400 million Kren remain alive. At the current rate of Xyrathi operations, that number will reach 0 in approximately 90 standard days. 90 days. The Council's next scheduled session on the Kren crisis is in 47 days. The subcommittee reviewing the proposed sanctions package is not expected to deliver its findings for 6 months. The peacekeeping resolution that failed last year cannot be reintroduced under Council rules for another 11 months. Another pause. His eyes swept the chamber. By the time this Council is ready to act, the Kren will be extinct, and every delegate in this chamber knows this. Every single one of you has known it for months, possibly years. You have known it, and you have continued to file your motions and convene your committees and draft your resolutions, and you have told yourselves that the process matters, that the rules exist for a reason, that patience is a virtue, that the machinery of civilization, no matter how slow, is preferable to the alternatives. His voice changed. Not louder, there was no need for volume in a chamber designed to carry whispers across its vast space. But something shifted in its quality, some fundamental resonance that made the hair on the back of every human neck in the chamber stand up and made every non-human delegate instinctively lean forward. "You are wrong." The two words hung in the air like a verdict. The process does not matter if it fails to produce results. The rules do not matter if they can be weaponized by those who have no intention of following them. Patience is not a virtue when it is used as an excuse for inaction. And the machinery of civilization is not preferable to the alternative when the alternative is the only thing that will keep 300 million people alive. He reached into his jacket and produced a thin tablet, a human device primitive by galactic standards but functional. He tapped the screen and a holographic display sprang to life above the dais. It showed a star chart, a section of the verge with the Kren system highlighted in red. Around it, blue icons represented ships, hundreds of them, thousands. 14 hours ago, the United Earth Governance deployed the 1st through 5th interstellar fleets to the Kren system. Total personnel, 240,000. Total ships, 317, including 12 capital ships, 48 cruisers, and 257 support vessels. Travel time at maximum burn, 61 days. The chamber exploded again. This time, the noise was not confusion, it was something closer to panic. Humanity's military capabilities were not a secret. They were, however, something that the galactic community had consistently underestimated. When humans had first arrived on the galactic stage, their technology had been centuries behind the median for council species. Their ships were slower, their weapons were cruder, their energy generation was less efficient. The council had assessed them as a minor species, a curiosity perhaps, but not a significant power. But humans did something that no other species in galactic history had ever done. They improved. Not gradually, not at the measured pace that characterized technological development among the Velnathi or the Ithkari or the Torvalans, but explosively. In 237 years, humans had gone from crude fusion drives to antimatter propulsion. They had gone from projectile weapons to directed energy systems that could crack a moon. They had gone from a single-planet species with no off-world infrastructure to a civilization with colonies on 14 worlds, orbital shipyards around 6 more, and a military-industrial complex that, by the Council's own classified assessments, was now producing warships at a rate that exceeded every member species of the Council except the Xyrathi Dominion itself. No one had fully internalized what that meant, not until this moment. The Xyrathi Dominion has approximately 400 warships in the Kren system, Hale continued, speaking over the chaos as though it did not exist. Our intelligence indicates that they have been reinforced by elements of their second fleet within the last 30 days, likely in anticipation of a final assault on the remaining Kren population centers. Our forces will arrive in approximately 60 days. We expect to achieve orbital superiority within 72 hours of arrival. Ground operations will commence immediately thereafter. Councillor Vithran of the Xyrathi Dominion moved. He was the lead delegate for the Xyrathi, a massive specimen even by his species standards, with scales so dark they seemed to absorb light. He rose from the delegation platform with a fluidity that was at odds with his bulk, and his translator, designed for the Xyratha's hissing, sibilant language, rendered his words in a voice that sounded like steel dragging across stone. "This is an act of war," Vithran said. "The Dominion will not tolerate human interference in our internal affairs." Hale looked at him, and for the first time since he had entered the chamber, something other than boredom appeared on his face. It was not anger, it was not fear, it was something far more unsettling. It was recognition, the look of a predator who has finally spotted its prey. "You are welcome to try to stop us," Hale said. The words were simple, matter of fact, delivered with the same flat tone that Hale had used for everything else. But something in them, some combination of the words themselves and the way they were spoken and the species that was speaking them, sent a physical shudder through the chamber. The Torvalans stopped their seismic communication. The Lumiveri went pale, not white, but the specific washed-out gray that their species produced in states of existential dread. Several of the smaller delegates simply left, fleeing the chamber on legs or wings or propulsion systems, unable to bear the tension. Because every species in the galaxy knew, on some instinctual level, what humans were. They were predators, not the refined, dignified predators of the Ithkari, who had long since transcended their origins. Not the calculating, patient predators of the Xyrathi, who had channeled their hunting instincts into imperial expansion. Humans were something else, something that the galaxy had not seen in 11,000 years of civilized existence. They were apex predators from a world that had been a death trap for every other species that had ever lived there. They had evolved on a planet where the climate could kill you, the wildlife could kill you, the plants could kill you, and the other humans could definitely kill you. They had survived not despite their planet but because of it. Because their planet had spent 4 billion years forge testing every organism on its surface, and humans were the ones who had passed every test. And now those apex predators had built warships. "Let me be clear about what is happening," Hale said, turning back to the chamber. "We are not asking for permission. We are not requesting a mandate. We are not seeking a coalition. We are informing this council of our actions as a courtesy because the charter requires it and because we still believe that this institution has value even if it has forgotten that value itself." He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice dropped to something almost conversational. "The United Earth Governance has spent 237 years learning from this council. We have studied your history, your laws, your protocols, your philosophies. We have marveled at the Chamber of Infinite Voices. We have been humbled by the Accord of Silent Stars. We have tried in good faith to be good members of this community. We have filed our motions and sat through your committees and learned your gestures and memorized your procedures. And in those 237 years, we have learned something that none of you seem willing to say out loud." He looked at Talaris Vex. He looked at Kreeth. He looked at Asara. He looked at the hundreds of delegates who had spent 4 years doing nothing while a species was annihilated. The machinery of civilization only works when everyone agrees to let it work. And when someone refuses, when someone decides that the rules don't apply to them, that the process is just a tool to be exploited, that the patience of others is a weakness to be leveraged, then the machinery doesn't slow down, it breaks. And when it breaks, you don't get to hide behind it anymore. You have to act directly, imperfectly, messily, with all the terrible consequences that action entails. You have to do the thing that every one of you has spent 11,000 years building institutions to avoid doing. You have to fight. The chamber was silent, truly silent, not the absence of the matrix, but the presence of something deeper. A stillness that came from 700 species simultaneously confronting a truth that they had spent millennia avoiding. Counselor Kreeth moved forward on her 6 legs. Her personal translator was still active, but for a moment she did not use it. She just stood in front of the dais and looked up at Soren Hale with her compound eyes, eyes that could see in spectra that humans could not imagine, eyes that had watched 4 years of diplomatic failure with the full, terrible clarity of a species that experienced the world more richly than any other in the galaxy. "You have started a war," she said finally through the translator. "No," Hale said, "the Zyrathi started a war 4 years ago. We are ending it." That is a distinction that will not survive contact with reality. When human ships engage Zyrathi ships, the Dominion will respond. They will target human colonies. They will invoke their alliances. The Torvalan Consortium supplies 30% of the Dominion's raw materials. They will be drawn in. The Ithkari remnant shares a border with Dominion space. They will be forced to choose sides. This will not end in the Kren system. It will spread. It will consume the Verge. It may consume the entire galaxy. Hale nodded yes. The single word landed like a physical blow. Kreeth's mandibles snapped shut with an audible click. "Yes," she repeated. "Yes, it may spread, it may escalate, it may become the largest conflict this galaxy has seen since the War of Shattered Suns. And we have assessed that risk, and we have decided that it is acceptable." "Acceptable," Kreeth said, and the flatness of the translator could not entirely mask the incredulity in her clicking voice. 400 million Kren are going to die in 90 days, Counselor. That is not a risk. That is a certainty. The only question is whether we allow it to happen or we do something to stop it. We have chosen to stop it. If stopping it requires a war, then we will fight a war. If stopping it requires us to stand alone against the Zyrathi Dominion and every ally they can muster, then we will stand alone. Because the alternative is doing nothing, and doing nothing is not something that humans do. "That is not how diplomacy works," Talaris Vex said from behind him. She had moved closer, her personal translator projecting her words with a cold precision that matched her expression. "Diplomacy is the art of preventing war. It is the mechanism by which civilized species resolve their differences without resorting to violence. What you are describing is the antithesis of everything this council represents. With respect, Arbiter Vex, diplomacy is the mechanism by which civilized species resolve their differences without resorting to violence when all parties are acting in good faith," Hale said. "The Zyrathi are not acting in good faith. They have not been acting in good faith for 4 years. They are using your diplomacy as a weapon, a delay tactic that allows them to continue their extermination while you debate procedural niceties. And every day you debate, another 10,000 Kren die." He turned to face her fully. "You built this chamber to give species a place to talk instead of fight. That is a noble purpose. But you forgot something that every human child learns on the playground. If someone is hitting you, talking to them about how hitting is against the rules will not stop the hitting. You have to make them stop. And sometimes the only way to make them stop is to hit back." The silence that followed was different from the ones that had come before. It was heavier, more thoughtful. It carried within it the weight of 11,000 years of accumulated assumptions being tested against a species that did not share those assumptions. It was Asara who broke it. The ancient Ithkari rose from her seat, and the chamber turned to her with an attentiveness that bordered on reverence. She did not use a translator. She did not use sign language. She walked to the center of the chamber floor and stopped, and she made a gesture that had not been seen in the chamber of infinite voices for over 8,000 years. One hand raised, palm forward. The other hand brought to the chest, fingers curled inward. The Ithkari gesture for I remember. The chamber held its breath. Asara held the gesture for a long moment, and then she lowered her hands and spoke. Her voice was low, and without a translator, only the Ithkari delegation and the humans understood her. But her posture, her movements, the ancient gravity of her presence, all of these communicated something that transcended language. Then she sat down. It was Kreeth who translated, her own device picking up Asara's words and rendering them in basic. Counselor Asara says, "The Ithkari remember what it means to be the only ones willing to act. We remember the cost, we remember the guilt, and we remember that it was necessary." Hale closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had changed in his expression, something that, on a human face, might have been interpreted as gratitude or recognition or the shared burden of a terrible knowledge. 8,000 years ago, Hale said quietly, the Ithkari were the only species in the galaxy willing to intervene in the purge of the Vienara. Every other species, including the Velnathi, including the ancestors of half the species in this chamber, cited process, protocol, and precedent as reasons to do nothing. The Ithkari acted alone. They stopped the purge. And then, when it was over, the rest of the galaxy condemned them for violating the rules. He looked around the chamber. History does not remember the species that followed the rules. History remembers the species that did the right thing. The Ithkari are remembered. The Vienara, what was left of them, remembered until the last of them died. And the galaxy moved on and built more rules and told itself that it had learned its lesson. Clearly, it did not. The next hour was the most contentious in the Chamber of Infinite Voices since its construction. Delegates argued, through inadequate translators, through gestures, through the few shared languages that existed between species that had prolonged contact. The Zyrathi delegation, for their part, maintained their composure with the cold discipline of their species. Counselor Vithran did not shout, did not threaten, did not bluster. He simply stated, multiple times and with increasing simplicity, that the Dominion would treat any human military action in the Kren system as an act of war, and that the consequences would be total and absolute. Hale responded to each repetition with the same words, noted. The Torvalan delegation, after an extended period of internal seismic communication, issued a statement through their Velnathi relay. The consortium would not support the Zyrathi militarily but would also not support the humans. They would remain neutral. This was, by the standards of galactic politics, a significant blow to the Dominion. The Torvalans provided not just raw materials but also refueling stations and repair facilities that the Zyrathi military relied on for verge operations. The Ithkari delegation said nothing. Asara sat in her seat with her eyes closed and her hands resting on her knees, and her silence spoke louder than any words could have. Other species began to speak up. Smaller species, ones that lacked the military power to intervene on their own but that had spent 4 years watching the Council fail to protect a defenseless people. The Felari, a cloud-dwelling species from a gas giant whose delegation consisted of 3 floating, translucent beings that communicated through modulated light patterns, issued a statement through a borrowed translator. The Felari support the human action and will provide medical assistance to Kren survivors. What? The Esthanari, a fungal-based species that existed in a symbiotic network spanning 7 worlds, transmitted a statement through the Council's emergency communication system, a statement that had been approved by their planetary network consciousness, and that therefore represented the unanimous will of their entire species. The Esthanari will grant human forces passage through Esthanari space and will provide logistical support. One by one, species that had been silent for 4 years began to speak. Not many, perhaps 30 in total out of 700, but 30 was more than 0. 30 was a crack in the dam. The session lasted for 3 hours, far longer than the 1 hour granted under the right of universal address, but no one moved to enforce the time limit. At the end of it, Talaris Vex stood on the dais and made a statement that would be analyzed by historians for centuries. The Galactic Council acknowledges the human delegation's statement regarding the deployment of military forces to the Kren system. The Council does not endorse this action. The Council does not condemn this action. The Council notes that the human delegation has acted within the letter of the Charter, if not within its spirit, and that the Charter provides no mechanism for preventing a member species from taking independent military action outside of Council-sanctioned operations. She paused and her crest shifted, a subtle movement that Velnathi diplomats would later argue about for decades. The Council will convene an emergency session in 47 days, as previously scheduled, to review the status of the Kren crisis. In the interim, the Council urges all parties to exercise restraint. It was nothing. It was the same empty language that the Council had been producing for 4 years. But it was also, in its own bureaucratic way, an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the Council's machinery had been bypassed, and that there was nothing it could do to reassert control. Soren Hale stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the Chamber of Infinite Voices without another word. The human delegation followed him. Behind them, the chamber sat in the peculiar silence of a world that had just changed and had not yet realized it. 3 weeks later, the translation matrix was restored. The human engineers who had disabled it had done so cleanly, and the Velnathi technicians who reactivated it found no damage, no sabotage, just a system that had been politely and methodically shut down. The Council's proceedings resumed, motions were filed, committees convened. The machinery of galactic diplomacy ground on as it had for 11,000 years. But something was different. The Kren crisis was no longer the primary topic of discussion. It had been eclipsed, replaced on the Council's agenda by a single question that no one had ever thought to ask before, a question that cut to the very foundation of what the Council was and what it was for. That question was not about the Kren, it was not about the Xyrathi, it was not about humanity. The question was, what happens when the process fails? It was a question that every species in the galaxy had been afraid to ask, because the answer was too terrible to contemplate. If the process, if the rules, the protocols, the committees, the resolutions, the entire 11,000-year edifice of civilized discourse could fail, then what was left? If talking could not solve every problem, then what could? Humans knew the answer. Humans had always known the answer. It was written into their biology, encoded in their history, woven into every myth and legend and story they had ever told themselves. The answer was simple and terrible and ancient. You fight. You fight and you accept the consequences, because the alternative is surrender. The alternative is sitting in a beautiful chamber carved from a dead star and watching a species die while you draft your next resolution. 61 days after Soren Hale walked out of the Chamber of Infinite Voices, the human Fifth Interstellar Fleet arrived in the Kren system. The battle lasted 9 days. The human forces achieved orbital superiority in 4. The Xyrathi, who had never faced a peer adversary in 6,000 years of expansion, fought with the ferocity that their evolutionary heritage demanded, but they fought a species that had been forged in the same crucible, a species that understood predation on a level that the Xyrathi, for all their power, had never encountered. Humans did not fight like Velnathi, with careful planning and calculated maneuvers. They did not fight like Ithkari, with ancient precision and ritualized tactics. They fought like something that the galaxy had no frame of reference for. They fought like animals that had learned to build starships, but had never forgotten how to be animals. The Xyrathi lost 211 ships, the humans lost 34. On the 10th day, human ground forces landed on the largest remaining Kren moon. They found fewer than 200 million Kren survivors, huddled in underground shelters that the Xyrathi had been methodically sealing and filling with poison gas. The humans broke the seals. They cleared the gas. They set up medical stations and distribution networks and communication relays. They saved 187 million Kren. It was not enough. It would never be enough. 2.5 billion were dead, and no amount of human intervention could bring them back. But 187 million were alive when they would not have been, and that was something, that was everything. The Xyrathi Dominion did not declare war on humanity. They threatened to. They postured. They mobilized their remaining fleets and positioned them along the human border and issued demands for reparations and concessions that they knew would never be granted. But they did not attack. Because the Xyrathi, for all their ferocity, were not stupid. They had watched the battle in the Kren system. They had seen their ships destroyed by a species they had dismissed as primitive. They had looked at the wreckage of their second fleet and done the cold, predatory calculus that their biology demanded, and the calculus had told them something that they did not want to hear. Humans were not prey. The Galactic Council, for its part, did not sanction humanity. It did not expel them. It did not pass a resolution condemning their actions. It did nothing because doing something would have required acknowledging what had happened, and acknowledging what had happened would have required admitting that the Council had failed, and admitting that the Council had failed would have required confronting the question that Soren Hale had forced upon them. What happens when the process fails? The Council's answer, ultimately, was the same answer it had always given to uncomfortable questions: silence. The Kren crisis was removed from the active agenda. It was archived, filed away in the vast bureaucratic labyrinth of the Council's records, where it would join the thousands of other crises that had been resolved through inaction and attrition. But the humans did not forget, and the Kren did not forget, and the 30 species that had spoken up in the chamber that day did not forget. And somewhere in the Verge, on a moon that had been scarred by weapons fire and poison gas and the slow, methodical cruelty of an empire that believed itself beyond consequence, a Kren child looked up at the sky and saw a human ship descending through the clouds, and did not know what it was, but knew on some level deeper than language or culture or understanding that it was a reason to hope. The Chamber of Infinite Voices stood for another 11,000 years after that day. The translation matrix hummed, the delegates filed their motions, the committees convened, the machinery of galactic diplomacy ground on, vast and patient and glacial. But if you listened very carefully, if you stood in the center of that ancient chamber on a quiet day and let the silence of the matrix wash over you, you could almost hear it. A crack, a fracture in the foundation. A hairline split in the edifice of civilized discourse, running from the human delegation's seats all the way to the central dais. The crack did not grow, not immediately, not for a long time. But it did not heal either. It waited, and the humans waited with it. The crack did not grow, not immediately, but it did not heal either. In the months that followed the Battle of the Kren system, a name that human historians had already capitalized and formalized before the last fires on the moons had stopped burning, the Galactic Council settled into an uncomfortable equilibrium that no one on either side had expected. There was no war, there was no peace. There was only the strange, suspended state of two civilizations that had drawn blood and were now measuring each other across the distance, like predators who had met at the edge of their territories and decided, for the moment, that the cost of crossing was too high. The Zyrathi Dominion withdrew its remaining forces from the Kren system entirely. This was not a surrender. The Dominion did not surrender, had never surrendered in 6,000 years of expansion. It was characterized as a strategic redeployment, and the Zyrathi Diplomatic Corps issued a statement through the newly restored translation matrix that described the withdrawal as a temporary adjustment of force posture in response to evolving operational parameters. No one believed this. The Zyrathi did not care whether anyone believed it. They had left, and that was what mattered. What replaced them was something the galaxy had never seen before. The human presence in the Kren system did not diminish after the battle. It grew. In the first month alone, the United Earth governance deployed an additional 40,000 personnel, engineers, doctors, agricultural specialists, linguists, educators, and a category of human that the galactic community had no existing framework for understanding: social workers. The humans did not simply rescue the Kren and leave. They stayed. They built. They dug wells and purified water and planted crops in the scorched soil of the moons. They set up schools for Kren children who had spent 4 years watching their world burn. They developed translation software specifically for the Kren language, a language that no human had spoken before the crisis, and that the Council's own linguistic archives had classified as low priority 4 years ago when the first requests for translation support had been filed. The Kren, for their part, responded in a way that surprised everyone. They did not worship the humans. Worship was not a concept that existed in their communal, non-hierarchical society. They did not fear them, despite the overwhelming display of violence that had accompanied their arrival. They did not treat them as saviors or conquerors, or any of the other archetypes that galactic sociology predicted for first contact between a traumatized pre-spaceflight species and an interstellar military power. They treated them as neighbors. The Kren had a word for it, Threlin, which roughly translated to those who share the same soil. It was one of the most important concepts in their language, predating even their agricultural revolution, rooted in the ancient communal bonds that had defined their species since before they had developed tools. Threlin was not friendship. It was not alliance. It was something deeper and more primal, the recognition that two beings existed in the same space, drew from the same resources, and were therefore bound to each other by the simple, inescapable fact of shared existence. The humans, to their credit, understood this, or at least they tried to. Dr. Lena Vasquez, the civilian administrator appointed by the UEG to oversee the Kren reconstruction effort, wrote a memo in the 3rd month of the occupation that was later leaked to the galactic press and became required reading in every diplomatic academy in known space. "We are not here to save the Kren," she wrote. "Saving implies a relationship between a powerful benefactor and a helpless recipient. The Kren are not helpless. They survived 4 years of systematic extermination with no spaceflight capability, no military, and no allies. They survive because they are extraordinarily good at staying alive and because their social structures are more resilient than anything our sociologists have ever encountered. We are here because someone needed to fight and we were willing to fight. The fighting is over. What remains is the work of Threlin, the work of sharing a world with people who are not like you and finding a way to make that sharing sustainable. It is the hardest work there is. It is the only work that matters. The memo was notable not for its content, which was, by human standards, fairly standard administrative philosophy, but for the fact that Vasquez had written it in Kren, with a human translator's note appended to each paragraph explaining the specific cultural context of the Kren words she had chosen. It was a document that could only have been produced by a species that had spent 200 years obsessively studying alien cultures not because they were required to, but because they wanted to. The galactic community noticed. The galactic community was not sure what to do with what it noticed. 6 months after the Battle of the Kren system, Ambassador Soren Hale returned to the Chamber of Infinite Voices. He did not shut down the translation matrix this time. He did not invoke the right of universal address. He did not make a dramatic entrance or deliver a thundering speech. He simply walked into the chamber at the beginning of a routine legislative session, took his seat, and raised his hand to be recognized. The chamber fell silent anyway. Talaris Vex recognized him. She had to. Procedural rules required the arbiter to recognize any delegate who requested the floor during a legislative session. But the weariness in her voice as she said, "The representative from Earth has the floor," was audible even through the Matrix's clinical translation. Hale stood, he smoothed his jacket, a gesture that several delegates noted was identical to the one he had made before shutting down the Matrix 7 months prior, and which therefore sent a brief wave of anxiety through the chamber. "Thank you, Arbiter," he said. "I have a motion to introduce." He paused and the chamber tensed. "I move that the Galactic Council establish a permanent standing military capability, under the direct authority of this body, for the purpose of enforcing Council resolutions when diplomatic means have been exhausted, or when member species are engaged in acts of genocide, extermination, or mass atrocity against non-member or pre-spaceflight species within the Council's recognized sphere of influence." The silence that followed was so complete that the distant hum of the nebula outside the chamber's transparent ceiling became audible, a low, resonant vibration that most delegates had never noticed in 11,000 years of sessions. The motion was, by any measure, revolutionary. The Galactic Council had never possessed a military force. It had never needed one, or rather, it had never believed it needed one. The Council's authority was derived from consensus, from the shared understanding that all member species benefited from the stability that the Council provided. Enforcement was economic trade sanctions, access restrictions, resource embargoes. The idea that the Council might possess the ability to physically compel a member species to comply with its resolutions was antithetical to the founding principles of the institution. It was also, as several delegates immediately pointed out through their translators, exactly what the Zyrathi had been accusing the Council of trying to establish for 6,000 years. The Zyrathi had consistently opposed any expansion of the Council's enforcement mechanisms, arguing, with some justification, that such mechanisms would inevitably be used to constrain the Dominion's legitimate expansion. If the Council had a military, the Zyrathi argument went, then the Council could dictate terms to any species, regardless of that species' power or position. Hale had anticipated this. His motion included a 23-page addendum that addressed every major objection the Council's legal scholars had ever raised regarding a standing force. The force would be composed entirely of volunteers from member species. It would be limited in size, no more than 5% of the combined military capability of all contributing species. It could only be deployed by a 2/3 supermajority vote of the full Council. It could only operate against member species in cases of documented mass atrocity, as verified by an independent investigative body. It could not be used for territorial disputes, trade enforcement, or any purpose other than the prevention of genocide. The addendum was meticulous. It was comprehensive. It was, several legal scholars noted with grudging admiration, a document that could only have been produced by someone who had spent years studying the Council's charter, its legal precedents, and its structural weaknesses. The motion was referred to committee. Of course it was. But this time, when the delegates filed their procedural objections and requested their amendments and scheduled their subcommittee hearings, there was a different quality to the delay. It was not the comfortable, practiced inertia of a body that knew it had all the time in the world. It was the cautious, self-conscious delay of an institution that had been publicly humiliated and was acutely aware that it was being watched, not just by its own members, but by the billions of sentient beings across the galaxy who had followed the Kren crisis and drawn their own conclusions about what the Council was and was not capable of. The committee took 9 months to produce its report. It recommended the creation of a peacekeeping and atrocity prevention force, with most of the specifications outlined in Hale's addendum. The recommendation passed out of committee by a narrow margin, 4 votes. The full council debated the recommendation for 3 months. During those 3 months, human diplomats did something that no other species had ever done in the council's history. They lobbied. Not quietly, not through the discreet back-channel negotiations that characterized normal council politics, but openly, aggressively, and with a shamelessness that bordered on rudeness. Human diplomats showed up at the delegation platforms of other species uninvited. They presented data, military analysis, economic projections, demographic modeling, with the relentless energy of a species that had decided that persuasion was just another form of combat. They cornered delegates in the corridors of the council complex. They sent lengthy, detailed messages to every government represented in the chamber. They gave interviews to the Galactic press, another human innovation that the council had never had to deal with, framing the debate in moral terms that made neutrality increasingly uncomfortable. "You are either for preventing genocide or you are not," Ambassador Hale said in one such interview, speaking directly into a recording device held by a Felari journalist whose species had never before encountered the concept of a press conference. "There is no third option. You can argue about the mechanism, you can argue about the thresholds, you can argue about the command structure and the rules of engagement and the funding model. But at the end of the day, the question is simple. If the Kren situation happened again tomorrow, would this body be able to stop it? And if the answer is no, then what exactly is the point of this institution?" The question reverberated. It showed up in legislative debates on 100 worlds. It was discussed in the communal forums of the KTH Tele, the resonance chambers of the Velnathi, the light choirs of the Lumivari. It was a question that could not be answered with procedural maneuvering because it was not a procedural question. It was an existential one. The vote was held on a standard cycle day, unremarkable in every way except for the fact that the Chamber of Infinite Voices was fuller than it had been in centuries. Delegates who had not attended a session in years were present. Observers from non-member species filled the public gallery. The Felari journalist who had conducted Hale's interview floated in a specially designed containment sphere near the ceiling, her bioluminescent body pulsing with a pattern that her species used to indicate bearing witness to history. The resolution passed, 514 to 186. The Zyrathi delegation voted against it. They did not speak, they did not filibuster, they did not threaten, they simply voted no and left the chamber. Soren Hale did not make a speech. He did not celebrate. He sat in his seat, still and silent, while the chamber erupted in the complicated emotional displays of 700 species, processing a moment that they would not fully understand for generations. When the noise finally subsided, Talaris Vex spoke from the dais. Her voice, through the matrix, carried the full weight of 11,000 years of institutional memory. "The resolution passes," she said. "The Galactic Council Peacekeeping and Atrocity Prevention Force will be constituted within 1 standard year. Contributions of personnel and materiel from member species will be coordinated through the newly established Peacekeeping Directorate." She paused, her crest shifted, not in the rigid patterns of protocol, but in something more organic, more vulnerable. "The Council thanks the human delegation for their contribution to this process." It was the closest an arbiter had ever come to saying you were right and we were wrong. It was not enough. It was not an apology. It was not a reckoning with the 2.5 billion dead who might have been saved if the Council had possessed the will to act. But it was a crack in the wall, a second one running parallel to the first. And cracks, as humans knew better than any species in the galaxy, have a way of spreading.